Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chelius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. Today's podcast is sponsored by the North Idaho College and their upcoming Accessibility Camp Coeur d'Alene, which is on August 2nd and 3rd in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. More information on the Alley Camp Symposium can be found at nic.edu/A11Y camp. So again, we want to thank them for being our sponsor for today's podcast. My name is Chad Chelius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor as well as director of training solutions and principal at Chax Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am Director of Media Productions here at Chax Training Consulting. And Chad and I are both certified as Accessible Document Specialists by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. If you'd like your certification, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certifications. Hey, Chad, how you doing, man?
I'm good, buddy. How are you doing?
I am recovering from Creative Pro Week, man. Phoenix was some stuff, man. That was, twofold. Really great conference. Was great to see everybody again and see conferences in person, coming back full swing. But man, it was hot.
104 degrees. Right? Yeah. I think I spent a total of like 10 minutes outside while we were there, At night, it wasn't too bad, right? At night, it kind of chilled out a little bit. And I know, this year, the Creative Pro Week was at a resort, right? And it was a little bit different from other years because you were somewhat confined to the resort, yes. And where like in other cities, we like to go to restaurants and stuff. And I was able to sneak away with Chris Converse and Mark Heaps one night. And we went to a fry bread restaurant, like a Native American restaurant. And that was really neat. That was cool. We don't have much of that in the Northeast, right?
Yeah, fry bread tacos are amazing. And
they really are.
I really love them. I spent a little bit at there's a shuttle that takes you over to the casino. I spent a little time there, won some, lost some, had some fun. I came out ahead, which is fine, which is good. So that's good. But normally, Chad, I pack my swimsuit every single time I go to conference when I know there's a pool, and every single time I never use it. I never have time. And I just,
I find that when I forget my swimsuit, I want to go to the pool.
Yep.
But when I remember my swimsuit, it never happens. Right?
Well,
so
this time I actually was able to go about 3 or 4 times. I was really nice to be able to go and experience that, especially when it's hot outside. It was really nice. So enjoyed our time. On a technical note, Creative Pro Week still is my absolute favorite. Yeah. Learn how to do stuff sessions. I mean, if you want to know where do I click, what do I do, how do I do it, Creative Pro Week really there's just nothing else like it. And I just can't say enough. If people ask me which conferences would you choose each year, Creative Pro Week is always on my number one list.
Yeah. And I would also say, like, I think what makes Creative Pro Week great is that, all of the speakers are always available. Yep. Right. It's like even if it's not after one of my sessions, just flag me down in the corridor and we can have a chat. You know what I mean? Yep. Like the speakers are very approachable. We love hearing from, the attendees. We love hearing about your workflows and your challenges and hopefully offer ideas or solutions to your idea. Hopefully offer solutions to your problems.
Yep.
And I just think it's a great, as a speaker, I love it. I think as much as people who are attending the conference, it's just a fantastic experience for everybody.
I'd really love to have a session that's like stump the stump the instructor, right?
Yeah.
Stump the speaker. And fielding those questions is like the highlight of my day, because it's what we do every day. It's that challenge, right?
It is.
And we have a lot of knowledge because we've been doing this so long and have worked through all these obscure challenges. So when you find one that's new, it's like, all right, right?
Oh yeah.
Let's dive into this and figure this out. And so it's been it's been a thing.
It keeps me up at night, right?
Yeah.
Like when somebody has a problem that I don't know the answer to, I'm like, oh my God, I got to figure this out, But Dax, it's also why you and I started this company.
Yep.
Right. Like, when you and I started this company, you and I kind of sat down and we're like, what is our objective? Like, what is our goal here? And we kind of unanimously both said, like, I just want to help people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And obviously we're trying to make a living doing this too, but our at our core, we just want to help people. And that's why a lot of our time is spent, offering our advice and our guidance to people, whether it's online, via email, via chats, because, really we're just trying to help people through this process.
I was, I think I mentioned this last podcast, maybe not, but, the Facebook group takes a fair amount of our time. And I was looking at some statistics, and last month there were 168 posts, and I responded to 148 of the comment, or maybe it's the other way around. There were 148 posts and I made 168 comments. So really it is, I would venture to say that we are the tech support for Acrobat for accessibility in that group, because you and I both also monitor the Adobe Acrobat users forum for Adobe. And I answer there are maybe 10 or 15 questions on a weekly basis that have to deal with accessibility. And that's probably even being generous. Whereas in the PDF accessibility group, we get that on the daily, right? I mean, there's, 6 or 8 questions every day, and sometimes way more than that. So I got to believe that our Facebook group is the largest PDF accessibility users group in the world. I mean, really, I've not yet found one larger. So
no question.
Yeah.
No question.
Well, today, Chad, we wanted to talk about PowerPoint, right? We always talk about Acrobat, and we probably will talk a little bit about Acrobat as it relates to PowerPoint, but we wanted to talk about the 10 tips for giving an accessible presentation. We always talk about the PDF aspect of it, but accessibility goes far beyond the digital content. And as a presenter, when you're standing on stage or in a room in front of people, there are some accessibility things that we need to remember. And I thought we'd go over those 10 best practices that you and I have come up with. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a great thing to remember. I mean, you and I both, we present at conferences, but we also present to corporations, and even to classes. Right. And, I think these 10 things we're about to go over is just good presentation practices, but it also happens to really help on the accessibility side as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And the first one, right? What's the first one, Chad?
So the first one, and this may sound really obvious, right? But the first one is speak clearly and slowly. You and I have been doing this a long time, Dax. And I remember in my early days, you've got the nervous jitters when you're standing up in front of people, and you have a tendency to fly through your content, right? You
go fast. I don't know anybody like that. No one I know tries to cram 100 pounds of crap in a 10-pound sack in a 20-minute presentation. I that's just, who would do that?
We're talking about the guy who comes to me and he's like, hey, my PowerPoint deck is 168 slides. Yep. I've got 30 minutes to give my presentation, and I'm like, oh my God, dude.
Yeah.
So
maybe not quite that bad, but
I know I'm exaggerating, but so basically enunciate your words clearly and avoid rushing through your presentation. Right. And this is where, Dax, you and I inherently have different speaking styles,
Yep.
right? Because you've said to me before, like, why do you pause when you're speaking? And I'm like, well, I do that on purpose, right? Like in between topics and in between ideas, I tend to pause to let it sink in, right? To let people kind of absorb what I'm saying. Um, and I think you're a little bit more like, I gotta fill every gap with content, right? As you're speaking.
Well,
I'm not saying you do it fast. I'm just saying, like, you want to make sure that every ounce of dead space is filled.
Well, I find it's interesting because I'll ask a question, and oftentimes you will sit and go, and then speak, because you're gathering your thoughts, and that's completely appropriate. But in that second and a half of pause, for me as a person with ADHD, that is like 10 seconds, and I'm looking at the waveform of the podcast, and it's just like like flatlined, and I'm just like, speak, please speak, say something. And
Dax is like, I gotta say something.
and so it's interesting. It just is part of my ADHD issues.
No. And this is all good. And so basically, when you enunciate your words clearly and avoid rushing, it helps individuals with hearing impairments, non-native English speakers, and those who rely on lip reading. Right. And I think those are aspects that we tend to forget about. Right. I mean,
I tell my kids, I said, look, if you're not looking at me when you speak, I can't hear you. And they're like, what do you mean? and they'll be in the other room, or they'll be just looking away from me. And I'm like, turn around, I can't hear you. And they're like, why do you say that? Of course you can hear me. I said, no, I need to be able to read your lips while you're talking, so I can put the two together and understand what you're saying. Because when I only hear you, I have a hard time getting it. And it's a thing. So
yeah, I always give my wife a hard time, because she'll be like, Chad, and I'll be like, what? And then she'll turn and start rummaging through the closet looking for clothes and continue talking to me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can't hear what you're saying, So I think it's important, right?
Yeah.
And to, keeping in mind people who need to be able to read your lips and be able to understand. I think it's really important.
Well, there's a couple of other things along this topic that I want to make sure we cover. First of all, if there's a comment that people usually make, which is, well, if somebody needs me to read my lips, I need them to let me know. And the answer to that is absolutely not. Right. They do not need to self-identify, I have a disability and I need you to accommodate me. I mean, yes, it's nice if someone does that, but you're violating HIPAA. You're requiring them to self-identify, and that's not good stuff.
Yeah, you don't want to force them to disclose their disability to you, right? Yeah. They should not have to do that. So,
and Sam Evans pointed something else out on LinkedIn the other day. And she said in one of her posts, and we love Sam, she's part of the IAAP, but she posted a thing that says, look, if you're presenting and someone says, here's the microphone, or the microphone's not working, and you say, don't worry, I've been, for me, I would say, I'm a Boy Scout leader. I'm used to talking to large crowds. I'll use my Boy Scout leader voice. And then inevitably what happens is you turn around and face the screen to look at something or point something out. And now that what normally would have been clear, regardless of which way you're facing, is not. And then those who are relying on lip reading, or those who are relying on large, high volume audio, they don't get what they need. And you just said, no, I got you. And yet you don't. And I think I have a hard time with it. Usually at the end of a session when we're in Q&A and somebody raises their hand, and getting that microphone over to them before they start speaking is a challenge sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so we are asked as presenters to repeat the question while we're speaking. So I think that the takeaway here is use the mic. Whether you think you need to or not, it only benefits everybody. And saying, can you guys hear me in the back? You don't need me to use a mic. Again, forces someone to self-identify.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
So what's number 2, Dax?
Providing captions, right? So most people don't know that in PowerPoint, you actually can provide not only captions, but subtitles. So PowerPoint, although we know anything automatic captions is not the best, you can turn on captions, and if your computer is linked through your mic, which you have to make sure that that's the case, because if you're connected on a lav mic to the back room, that's not being picked up by your computer. You have to kind of port it through your computer so that it picks everything up, but it will put captions on the screen for you. In addition to that, though, you can go into the presenter, into presentations, and actually change the language it's presenting the captions in. And once you go from English speaking to English captions to English speaking and Spanish text, it's now called subtitles. And I think people use those terms interchangeably all the time. Right. So
yeah, for sure.
So there's like 13 or 14 different languages that you can choose from in there. And I've looked at the Spanish one, and it does pretty okay. I think in a pinch, we always would opt for a live translation, but in a pinch, it's not bad.
Well, I will tell you, I mean, I have started using closed captions more and more.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said this in a previous podcast. We were watching Ted Lasso, and I could not understand some of the characters. Their English accent was so, and to be fair, I'm not good with accents. Like my brain does not process accents very well. But I had to turn on closed captioning, and so I think that could be valuable in a number of situations, right? I mean, when I'm assuming maybe other people have challenges with accents as well, and I have trouble understanding what they're saying, but captions would be super helpful. It'd be very clear to know, what they were saying.
Absolutely.
All right. So number 3 is, when possible, utilize sign language interpretation. Arrange for a qualified sign language interpreter to be present during your presentation, enabling deaf attendees to understand the spoken content through sign language. And again, this is another area that we tend to forget about. At the accessibility conferences that we do, Dax, there is always a sign language interpreter available, right? They're very, very good about that, but that's also their focus, right? Because it's an accessibility conference, that is front and center. But I've also done work for some federal agencies, and in the class there have been people who are either deaf or hard of hearing, and I actually have a sign language interpreter in the class, for those users,
Well, and there's been some new a new legislation proposed about making online digital conferencing accessible as a requirement for state and federal agencies, that you have to have captions, that you have to have ASL interpreter present, et cetera, et cetera. So, as we kind of move from best practices to requirements, just realize, guys, if you're in your seat listening to this or watching this, and you think, oh, well, I don't have to do that because nobody in our audience is deaf, or nobody in our audience needs this. At some point, it's not going to be a preference. It's going to be a requirement. And so start working it into your workflow now, so that when it becomes a requirement, you're set, rather than scrambling to try to figure out, how do we incorporate this? Maybe I'm using a platform for my video conferencing like Blue Jeans or something else that doesn't accommodate ASL. Not that it does or doesn't, I don't know for sure. But, I know that Zoom or Teams, I forget which one, has an ASL overlay now, where you can put the ASL person in a kind of picture in picture, so that someone can have that more accessible.
I've run into that. Like, I was teaching a class one time, and the interpreter didn't show up. And the person in the class made me aware of an app that I could download on my phone, and I would just talk into my phone, and it would then put the words on his phone.
Yeah.
So it was like a way that we could kind of overcome that. I'm sure it was not as elegant, right, as having a sign language interpreter, but it, we were able to overcome the challenge. It was pretty neat technology, I will say.
Well, and there's also things you have to think about, that if people are using ASL, then they need to be able to have it in. It's easy when everybody speaks English, but what happens when you've got people in multiple languages, right? We were at Camp Coeur d'Alene last year, and there was a presentation on holding conferences in other areas, and they were talking about the struggles of multilingual translation, captioning, ASL interpreters, BSL interpreters, all the different versions of European Sign Language, all of that. And it just made me go, yeah, no, I am not interested in holding a conference on our own anytime soon.
Yeah.
So the next one is the use of high contrast visuals, right? So accessibility is not just blind people, screen readers, and ASL, but it's also people with low vision. I have low vision. You wear glasses. I know that when I'm struggling to look for my glasses. I think I've got my case is sitting here, but my glasses are not. But I know that when I'm looking at a screen, I'm not always 10 feet away. We were just at Creative Pro Week, and those screens were sometimes 100 feet away from those screens in the bigger rooms. And there were times where, bless their hearts, they weren't thinking about color contrast in their presentations, but people were using light blue text or yellow text or something that was hard to read against the backgrounds that they were using. And so, that's important.
I could tell you, Dax, and I see this all the time on billboards, right? Like when I'm driving on the highway or on the roads, and I see a billboard that I can't read.
Yeah.
Like it absolutely drives me crazy, right? And I feel like it's the way something looks on your screen is very different in how it looks in I don't know what the billboard size is. Is it 40 feet by 20 feet or something like
usually
that?
It's 40 by 10. It's usually like a 1 to 4, a 1 to 4 ratio. It's not always 40 feet, right. Sometimes 96 feet. But it's definitely harder to read. And you only have 2.5 seconds to read it because you're moving.
So, and I think the designers are failing to consider those variables.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I used to give a presentation on viewing distance and how that affects like how you design your content. But there's one in my hometown or the town I live in, and it was for a realtor, and her name was in this script font.
Yeah.
And it was a digital billboard.
Yep.
And the pixel density of the billboard was not able to maintain those thin serifs, and they just disappeared.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh my God, that's horrible. I mean, I could barely tell what her name was.
Well, and that's where testing, like we say, testing with a screen reader, because that's the live environment, testing that digital content. I'm sure they gave her a print proof of what it was supposed to look like, but not a print proof emulating the resolution that was going to happen when they put it through that software. Right?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a way to do that.
Oh,
right. I mean, the billboards the digital billboards have a resolution, and the pixels are probably this big.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
if
usually 25 DPI, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Photoshop has some plugins where you can pixelate an image based on a certain DPI and give it back to you. So,
and that'd be really valuable for a situation like this.
Yeah.
All right. The next one, and all of our audience is going to be familiar with this one. Provide alt text for your images, right? We've talked about this topic a million times on the podcast, but I always say, fundamentally, an image, there's no information to be obtained from a graphical object, right?
Yep.
Like a screen reader doesn't know what that is other than a graphic. And so it's up to us as humans to describe that image and explain what's happening, in that image. And so by adding alt text, I mean, how does that add value within PowerPoint, Dax?
Well, there's two different things to think about, right? One, we have the physical presentation, the actual standing up and talking, where your alt text is now your vocal text describing the image, right? And then of course there's the alt text in a PDF or in your live PowerPoint file. But going back to the presentation, we very often see people present a complex image and say, as you can see from this chart, sales are down. And you're like, or as you can see from this bar graph, we've got a lot of work to do in 2020. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? Rather than saying, as you can see, we've got a lot of work to do in 2020. This bar chart shows sales from 2017 to 2019, and we're at almost 50% less sales than last year, right? You give some contextual information that helps describe it. You don't have to stand up, and I've seen people do this, say, as you can see from this bar chart, with an axis on the left saying this and an axis on the right bottom saying this, and having 7 different data points saying la la la, and they walk through everything forensically like they're trying to explain it to someone who needs to draw it. The idea behind alt text is you're trying to show, why did I put this here in the first place? So yes, give a overall, what is it? It's a bar chart or a line graph or a pie chart or whatever. And then what's the range from 2017 to 2020? And then what's the trend? What's the main purpose, right? And if it means that you need to say, well, in 2017 we did $50 million in sales. In 2018 we did this, but you can walk through those data points if it's germane. But you don't need to if it's really the trend you're trying to show that we are down in sales.
Well, doesn't it come down to asking yourself what you want the user experience to be?
Well, we say that so many times, right?
Right. But I mean, I think it applies when we're talking about giving a presentation, right? And I think it's important to remember that we need to consider that not everybody may be able to see our presentation.
Right.
And so providing a description and what you're talking about, Dax, is really providing verbal alt text.
Yep.
Right. For that graphic. And to your point, you don't need to describe every single axis and data point. What do you want the user experience to be? What do you want them to get out of this graphic element, whatever it may be, and describe it accordingly?
The other thing you can do is give them a hand, and this goes actually to our number 8, but we'll talk about it here in a second. But what you can also do is give them a description ahead of time, right? If you need to write something longer for alt text, give them a digital description, a web page or a digital in email or a PDF or HTML file that gives the expanded descriptions of the things you're going to talk about. And so they could follow along on slide 2 or slide 6, where it talks about what graphic or whatever. You've got a longer description they know about before you get to it, so that there's extra information there. What's number 6, Chad?
So number 6 is Number 6 is avoid complex visual effects.
Yes.
Remember, you want to minimize the use of animations, transitions, or rapidly changing visuals, as they can be distracting or confusing for attendees with visual impairments. But I think we could also include people with cognitive impairments in there, and
people with who have epileptic, considerations. Yeah. I mean, that's all thing. And I hope everybody knows that animations in PowerPoint, it is not 1996. Please stop. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, really, the word by word animations or letter by letter or bullet. I get bullet by bullet if you want to do that. But you have to think about, if I need to make a PDF of this, How do I
Yeah.
make that happen? Because
Yeah.
if you layer all these animations, hide and show all on top of each other, your slide is a mess when it's not animated. So I typically, when I have to use animations, I'll do it the old school way, which is slide by slide. I'll have a transition or a color change or a something, and I'll just have those slides. And then what I do when I make the PDF is I hide the 3 slides that built the animation and just show the final one that has it compiled in a way that makes the most sense.
It reminds me, Dax. I mean, my son was born in 2000, right? So when he was born, iMovie on the Mac was really popular, right? So you could make movies out of your video footage. And I would put a transition between every single scene in the movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until like the following year, as I'm like watching a movie, I noticed that everything is just a cut.
Yep. They call it a jump cut.
A jump cut, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh wow, that's actually a lot nicer, right? I mean, I don't need to wipe. I don't need a wipe between everything or a vertical wipe or whatever I was doing. It's live and learn, right? But I think it applies to what we're talking about here in that for presentations. I mean, as a matter of fact, I mean, a lot of times I do a presentation in a PDF.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make a PDF and just go slide to slide, right? I don't need to build anticipation of the 4 bullets I'm about to show.
Follow the bouncing bullet.
I could just show them and talk to them, right? You know what I mean? So it's interesting. It's really interesting.
Well, number 7 is use accessible templates and features within PowerPoint. So remember that your heading level, this really goes back to, there's 2 considerations. Obviously, color contrast for colors in your headings and text and all of that. Stop with the 50% gray and the lighter colors. Keep things nice and bold. But from a PDF standpoint, we want to make sure that we're using the slide templates because we need heading level 1, which is always going to be tied to your title slide, and then heading level 2 for every other sequence slide after that. And if you don't use those those templates, you're not going to get the heading structure you need.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was a big learning experience for me because I, like many people, when I was building PowerPoint presentation, I'd be like, oh, text box.
Yep.
Text box, and it wasn't until later on, not even from an accessibility standpoint, but later on, I learned that when you leverage your master slides, it can really save you a lot of time because you apply a different master to the slide and the text just moves to where you have the title slide defined. I mean, it's really it's very efficient way of working in a presentation, as well as benefits the accessibility side of things.
Absolutely.
So the next one is to offer handouts or accessible digital materials, right? So I can't tell you how many times, I give a presentation and people are like, hey, can I have a copy of that, your slide deck? And PowerPoint does create a tagged PDF, right? I'll give it that. It tends to do it in a little bit of a messy way, right?
Yeah.
Nothing that you can't fix, with a little bit of time and effort, but at least you do have tagged content, and you could go in and clean it up and absolutely make an accessible PDF of that presentation. But it also, I think, speaks, Dax, to keep your presentations simple. Right? Don't like overload them with all this extra content. Have a title, have bullets, maybe a graphic, right? But it's when you start adding all these extra stuff is when it gets really messy.
Well, I think there's a fine line between a PowerPoint presentation and a handout. And I think people want to make the presentation the handout. And I think that most people will just cram everything in like they're designing a brochure and that's their slide because they're like, well, I want everything to be in the handout. Great. Make a handout. Give them the handout as a separate document, but your slide should have no more than about 4 bullet points. And really each bullet point should have no more than 5 or 6 words in it. Otherwise,
oh yeah,
they're looking at you to make sure you're reading the slide correctly and that you didn't miss anything. They're not paying attention to what you're really saying. They're trying to fact check you. And that's not really, kind of what we want. We want them to be engaged and present with you in the content that you're giving. I think it's really, really important. The one thing to remember about PowerPoint, I'm hoping they're fixing this, is that if you make a box and then you put text inside that box and you color the box in any way, it now makes a figure tag in the PDF and then nests the paragraph inside the figure, which causes all sorts of problems. And like, we use Common Look to fix that because we can just find every instance of a paragraph inside a figure and level those up. But if you have to do that manually everywhere, that's can be a really big time suck for you.
Yeah.
And honestly, it creates alt text errors and all sorts of stuff. So just know that that's a thing. The old school way we would have never taught this way back, when,
Right.
but is to put the colored box on one as one object, and then the text on top of it as the other. Mark the box as decorative. But we're hoping they're working on fixing that. I have it on fairly good authority that they know it's an issue and that it's on their radar. So we'll see.
Well, and Microsoft is there's definitely a initiative on Microsoft's part to.
They have a huge team for address accessibility
to improve this. So that's good. It's good that there's people on it. What is number 9, Dax?
Speak clearly and use descriptive language. And I think we've covered this really kind of early on. But remember, here's one thing to note. If you have an ASL interpreter on stage, if you're reading your content, if you're reading an excerpt or something else, purposely go slower. Because what I was told is that you read, like when you have to read text and speak it out loud, you speak exponentially faster than when you're just talking in a natural language. So if I'm looking at my slide and I say, speak clearly and use descriptive language, enunciate your words clearly and use descriptive language to explain visual or key points, that's way fast for someone who's trying to interpret in ASL those words. So be really aware of what you're reading and really try to slow down to help those interpreters be able to keep up with what you're saying.
I mean, I've often felt bad for interpreters who were doing my sessions, because if I'm talking about InDesign, it's a very technical session, right? And so when I say, go to the object menu and choose the object export options option, click on the description tab and choose custom from the alt text drop-down menu, they got to be getting tired. Right. Yeah. I mean, they got to be like, you know what I mean? Like trying to keep up with me. So to your point, what I should really do is say, okay, go to the object menu, go down to object export options, right? Yep. And just take my time as I'm doing it so that they can, so they're not like struggling to keep up. Because...
Well, and from a user standpoint, I will tell you, Chad, I've been in the audience where I'm trying to follow along, and the instructor is just going, and I'm trying to look down at what I'm doing and look up at the screen and follow along with what they're doing. And if that pause isn't there, I'm lost. And then half the time I just get frustrated and stop.
Well, and that's why it's also frustrating from our perspective when there's people in the audience who are like, oh, I'll just check my phone real quick for an email or something. And they like totally miss what you just went over. You know what I mean? It's like you got to really pay attention, Don't
and then
they're
the first one to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, can you go over that again? And you're like, yeah, if you were on your phone, you would have saw what I did.
All right. So the last one is allow for questions and clarifications. Encourage your attendees to ask questions or seek clarifications throughout your presentation, ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to understand the content fully. And I could tell you, like, I very much prefer that people ask me questions during my presentation.
Yep.
Right? Because I know what that's like. It's like, save your questions for the end. But it loses its vigor.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, when
Context.
you have a question, it loses the context. So I would much rather you just raise your hand and let me, call on you and just ask me the question then and there, because it's probably going to be way more relevant at that point in the presentation than if we wait to the very end. And then I'm going to be like, wait, okay, what was I doing when you saw that? Like, I'm trying to remember.
Or let's go back to that file, and then you got to go find it and get in the right spot, and whatever. So yeah, it can definitely be a thing. Colleen Gratzer is someone who I look up to as a person who speaks very clearly and really emphasizes the pause and letting people digest things. And she's shared with me some of the comments that she's received from presentations she's given, where they have really said, you know what, you were just so easy to follow and understand. And I really appreciate the pace at which you deliver information. So whenever I get on a roll and I start to get too fast, I really try to think about her. What would Colleen do? Right?
WW, what is it?
CD,
WWCD, right?
Yeah. Right. So definitely. And Colleen Gratzer has a podcast too called Design Dominations, and they her podcast is really great. I would suggest if you are in the creative field at all, doing graphic design or marketing at all, Colleen is at creative-boost.com/podcast. And matter of fact, she just did one, episode 153, 9 tips for creating accessible hyperlinks, or how to write a creative brief, the risks of having one bad client, all sorts of really good stuff. She did a session on imposter syndrome that still to this day just hit home for me so much. So yeah, Colleen Gratzer, and her podcast is Design Domination. So she's streaming on all podcast platforms as well. So
yeah. She's also on Medium.
Yeah,
I noticed. So she's everywhere.
Well, if you want, so we've gone through all of these 10 tips, Chad, and I'm sure everyone is like, wow, can I get this? Where can I get this? This is the only, you're only going to know this if you listen to the podcast. I'm not going to put this in the post of the social media post when we post for the podcast, but the URL, if you go to our website, accessibilityunraveled.com/PPT, you will get a form that you can fill out to get this cheat sheet. I'll put it in one single PDF for you, and you'll be able to download these top 10 tips for giving an accessible presentation. And feel free to share those with anyone in your group, right? And PPT is uppercase. So accessibilityunraveled.com/PPT in uppercase, and that will get you to the form to download this handout.
Well, listen, everybody, I want to thank you for tuning in on today's podcast. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you appreciated our discussion about presenting accessibly. And once again, we want to thank the North Idaho College and their upcoming Accessibility Camp Coeur d'Alene, which is on August 2nd and 3rd in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. More information on the Alley Camp Symposium can be found at nic.edu/A11Y camp. My name is Chad Chelius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where each week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.